welcome to an hour talking about Know Your Numbers. Value your time enormously, so I hope I will fill probably the hour. I'll try and get to the questions in the last 10-15 minutes, but I do want this to be worthwhile, interesting, informative, and really give you an understanding about how your body works that maybe you haven't taken before. My background, you're wondering who's taking this session, is that I am a physiologist. So I'm someone who's worked in the study of human health for 25 years. What I've been doing in those 25 years is trying to work out who is healthy and who is not, who is well and who is not. And I've done much of that in the work of health screening. So some of what we're going to talk about today falls into that category, which is testing individuals and trying to work out whether they're healthy or not. If I can go to the next slide, please, team, that'll be a dream. Oh, there we go, about me. Now, it won't all be about me, you'll be pleased, it's actually about you. I've got a few different roles, but the general theme is that in these 25 years, I've tried to work out how we can detect who is well and who is not, and worked in the presence of data to inform those decisions. So historically, my early part of my career was in running a sort of annual health screen, annual health check with nurses and doctors, where all the parameters we talk about today were a key part of that. But then it's not just enough to test people, it's what you do with that information afterwards. Where do these results come from? What are the factors that influence them? And how does the average person understand that and move it into their quality of life? So I work with Latus as Director of Wellbeing, and yet I'm here talking about things that are normally more associated with disease and dysfunction. And a reason for that is when we get into the parameters we're talking about today, you'll find they do have a very close relationship with well-being in the area of lifestyle. So the numbers I'm going to talk about today, the parameters, all have some correlation with the way in which you lead your life and choices you might be making consciously and unconsciously. And what I'm really keen is at the end of this, you're able to make more informed, conscious choices than you were before this hour began. I work in a variety of different guises. I won't go on about me any longer because I want to get into the data. But generally, as a physiologist, my job is to understand how you work, what are the data points that enable better decision making, and how do we prove that if you make a change, that it's been impactful. Again, I'll field your questions towards the end, but let's get into some of the theory of what we're talking about. So, know your numbers, and there's a poll that's going to ask you whether you knew what's in Know Your Numbers or not. This is a product that we deliver at Latus, and I love it. You know, I've been involved in the construction of this product because these are parameters that we believe have a meaningful impact on your length of life, but also your quality of life. And they're numbers that we hear about, but often they're not personalized. And we'll talk a little bit about the science of the numbers. I'll give a framework to what these numbers would ideally look like. If you ask me nicely, I might even tell you my numbers later on. But principally, I want you to understand these parameters on the screen. I've got a screen to the side of me here. Why we collect them, what the logic of them are, and how you might be able to use that to inform the decisions you make day in, day out. Again, because I'm a physiologist, I'm not a physician, so I'm not a doctor. There'll be a point where, as a lifestyle specialist, we need to pass into the medical system. But what we're really interested in is how we can democratize these numbers, how we can put them in the hands of individuals to understand what they mean, and then be able to make choices whether they should access their general practitioner, access specialist support, or manage these parameters through lifestyle. And I'll try and cover that piece by piece. So we've got a whopper of an hour ahead of us. Strap in. I hope it's going to be interesting. Now, the important part to frame here is what are we talking about with these numbers? And of course, we're talking about health. And if we go to the next slide, please, team. Understanding health sits at the heart of understanding things like blood pressure and things like cholesterol, and also things like weight and body composition. On the screen here is my favorite graphic. I'm not, haven't got a top 10, but I've just got a top one. This is it. And this is the illness wellness continuum, which was originally constructed by Dr. John Travis in the 70s. And the idea of this graph is to try and help people understand whether they are working well or not working so well. I do like the World Health Organization definition of health, which is good health is a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So, for you to be well, or to be in good health, you need to have complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not just be unwell or not unwell. I think that's quite a challenge when we sort of take our Britishness. We say, when you ask someone, are they well? And they go, not bad. Nothing terrible has happened. And ultimately, not being unwell isn't the same as being extremely well. And I put this graph on the screen to help depict the fact that the human body, you, doesn't not work or work. We all sort of work on a linear basis. My physiology is really the mechanism that drives me. And my body, my physiology, can work extremely well. Let's think of this graph as the far right, plus 100. And that would enable me to do incredible sporting achievements, or it might enable very clear thinking, or enable a whole range of physical benefits. Conversely, my body might not work very well at all. And if it doesn't work in a particular pattern, it might be called disease, and it might cease to work, and we might call that death. And as a slight trigger warning, there's going to be quite a bit of discussion around premature death today, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks and strokes. So if that's something that's going to be a little too close to the bone, or is going to be something that's a little raw due to personal experience, I flag that with you now and totally understand if this isn't the right discussion for you. I'll try and bring some levity to this topic, but it's heavy and we've got to talk about it in a very factual sense. So why put this graph up on the screen? Well, interestingly, human physiology works on this linear basis, but what we're really interested in is when the body moves left of centre. So centre, or the neutral point, is where there's no discernible illness or wellness, and it's where most, again, British people would say, they're fine. I'm okay, nothing's wrong with me, don't feel amazing, nothing's wrong with me. And what we've got is this interesting piece, is that human physiology, particularly in ageing, is more likely to deteriorate at the point where it's starting to show signs of deterioration, or it's giving symptoms, or it's becoming dysfunctional. And actually, if we're waiting for signs and symptoms of dysfunction, we might be waiting a little bit too late. Human physiology normally tells us when it doesn't like something we're doing, through symptoms and other signs, but it may not tell us as early as we would like. And in health screening, I spent an awful lot of time trying to take parameters in blood or urine or metrics of the body that gave us a sense that someone's physiology was changing negatively, maybe before there was a sign, maybe before there was a symptom. We'll talk about diseases like diabetes later, where those signs and symptoms are quite late into the stage, and if we'd had something like a blood test earlier on, we might have prevented a whole range of challenges. So what I'm really interested today is not so much the well-being part of what I normally discuss, optimizing sleep and fitness and turning you into the best version of you, but being acutely aware that if your body is sliding towards dysfunction, then there are certain parameters that might both be reflecting that but also causing it. And that's the key parameters we're going to talk about today. For the next part of this, if we go to the next slide, that'd be lovely. We have to recognize that the key area that all those parameters connect to is cardiovascular disease. So cardiovascular disease we're going to talk about a lot, and that is any disease affecting the heart, cardio, or the blood vessels, vascular. So cardiovascular is not a disease, but instead an umbrella term that unifies things we might naturally associate with cardiovascular disease, like a heart attack, but also it would encompass, in most cases, cerebrovascular disease, like strokes, and even vascular dementia. So where people develop that form of Alzheimer's that's driven by a lack of quality blood flow to the brain. As you sit there now, you're running on oxygen, and your body's ability to get the air out of the atmosphere, put it in the lungs, turn it into blood, pump it around the body, get it into cells, get the waste product of carbon dioxide back from the cell, get it out of your mouth, or your nose ideally, that is your ability to live. You're running on oxygen. And the ability of that system, if it's superb, means you could run a marathon or do some incredible athletic events. If that system falls over and you cannot deliver oxygen to your tissues, again, that will be a huge trigger for cardiovascular disease and premature death. Now again, there will be cheery points in the talk today, but the reality is, for most people on this call, cardiovascular disease will be the likely cause of your death. And that's something that we ideally don't think about or talk about. But it's something to be really aware of earlier in our life cycle because of how potentially preventable that is. The graph on the screen is, again, a sort of doctored version of the World Health Organization, and it's showing that the incidence of people dying from cardiovascular disease is rising and predicted to rise even further. I find that quite extraordinary when we think about how clever medicine is, in the fact that we can do stem cell transplants and we can clone a sheep. We haven't cloned a human yet, or have we? There's incredible advances in the drugs that are available, incredible advances in surgery, but the incidence of people dying from a failure to be able to, again, keep this cardiovascular system robust is rising. And a huge aspect of that rise is because the system, the cardiovascular system that keeps you alive, is being challenged in more ways in the modern life than it's ever been challenged before. The life you'll lead today is really tricky for your cardiovascular system, from a lack of natural movement, to a lack of natural food, to a lack of natural light and dark, to a whole range of things that your physiology just hasn't adapted to understand. So it's really important we start to understand that not only is cardiovascular disease the biggest killer of humans on the planet, it's also rising, and that rise seems to be directly correlated with changes in our environment and our patterns of living. So we have to swim against the tide if we want to win today, and that's really, again, equipping ourselves with the tools to do so. Next slide, please. This is a pretty disgusting slide. Some of these are pretty grisly. Stay with me, because ultimately this will get to, again, what these parameters mean. But when we think of death, again, and ideally we don't, but if we think of death as the top of the pyramid, where does that come from? And I'm really interested that people understand what are the building blocks of why we go wrong. And the parameters we're going to talk about today, particularly blood pressure, particularly cholesterol, particularly glucose, and to a large extent, obesity and carrying excessive body fatness, and I'll talk about that rather than weight later. These are parameters that will directly cause, again, challenges to your physiology that make it more likely that you develop cardiovascular disease and die. But below those parameters are the things that cause them. And I always like to start a talk at the end. And the end of this talk rounds up to the fact that your physiology will respond to the quality of physical activity it gets or doesn't get. A huge component of all these parameters today will be dietary choices, negative and positive. There'll be a significant impact from smoking, it's a tough one, on all of the parameters today. It's a very tough thing for your physiology to swallow. And increasingly we're understanding the role of stress management and sleep as a trigger. And when we look at these results, it's not enough to just look at them and know them, we have to start to understand where they're coming from. And what I'll try and do is draw that link between understanding the parameter we're talking about and what causes it, and therefore what also might solve it, as part of this key discussion today. What is also vitally important is that every result I talk about today has two big components to it. The first is lifestyle. Those choices I make around whether I'm eating a good diet, moving, sleeping well, all the elements that we put under sort of almost the well-being banner. But they do also have a genetic component. And knowing whether the results you're recording are because your parents gave you a dodgy gene for getting rid of cholesterol, or whether your diet is too rich in a certain form of unhelpful fat, is impossible to determine. But when we have numbers, we can start to work to what is an individual solution. But I do want that to be right at the front and center of this talk today, that if you have poorly controlled numbers across the things I'm discussing, that doesn't mean you lead an unhealthy lifestyle. But improving your lifestyle might be a key component of improving those numbers. This isn't a blame game. This isn't you lead an unhealthy lifestyle, therefore you've got high cholesterol. It's the opposite. But when we understand these numbers and we understand the role lifestyle can play in partially causing them, and in many cases partially correcting them, we take a little bit more control. That, again, is not a particularly attractive slide. I want to stick on this one for a minute. When we think of cardiovascular disease, we have to, again, recognize all these different conditions: heart attacks, strokes, vascular, again, dementia, peripheral artery disease. Anything that can sort of go wrong gets bracketed under that banner. But the biggest contributor within cardiovascular disease is coronary heart disease, where the arteries that supply blood to the heart get damaged over time and don't do their job. And I want to go back one step, right back to school, and take you back to biology. That you've got two different types of blood vessels. You've got quite a few different types, but to be simplistic, you've got two main different types of blood vessels in your body. You've got the blood vessels that carry blood away from your heart to all your tissues, and you've got the blood vessels that carry blood back to your heart to refill with oxygen. Why this anatomy lesson, I hear you cry? Well, the arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood, again, away from tissues, and they have a muscular wall. And that muscular wall is sort of our downfall. They've got a muscular wall because blood vessels aren't just stupid pipes, they're clever. And if again, I think of a pipe as having a diameter, a muscular wall can constrict that parameter or it can dilate it. So they're part of my circulatory system. If I want to suddenly move blood from my stomach, having eaten, to my legs to go running, the blood vessels themselves will play a crucial role in that. So they've got muscly walls. Why is that relevant? Well, the biggest challenge to human physiology is that over time, most of the parameters we talk about today challenge that muscly wall. They challenge it, and they challenge it from where it goes from nice and wide and flexible to narrow and stiff. Now the graph you'll see on the page there is talking about something called atherosclerosis, which is really sits at the heart of cardiovascular disease, specifically heart disease. And when we understand that mechanism a little bit, we can start to understand why I'm so interested in the parameters we're talking about today. A crucial piece to look at, when I first started screening for heart disease, it was a real challenge, because the test I would use was that one you often see on TV programs with the lead stuck on someone's chest, and they would cycle on a hill that was getting steeper and steeper until they were exhausted on a fixed bike. And that was called a stress ECG. And I was told at the time, again, late 1990s, would you believe it, that was a really good preventative test for heart disease. Now, for you to record an abnormal stress test, the arteries that supply blood to your heart need to be at least, really, 70% blocked. That means that muscular wall has changed so much that the inside is now reduced to just 30% of its capacity. And in some cases, 85, 90% blocked. And I always found it interesting that that was being called a preventative test. Is it a preventative test if the test catches you at 70, 80, 90% blocked? Or is it a preventative test someone that finds you at 10% and steers you away from ever going to 20%? Now, what's also interesting about the development of coronary disease or blood vessel disease, as you're seeing on the screen here, and just again, so you see that blood vessel is scooped away from you. And what we get is, over time, we get this change in the artery wall that people used to call cholesterol clogging up our arteries. And I need to unpick that a little bit, it's not entirely true. But the most fascinating piece here is the timeline that runs underneath this, which is at what point does the progressive changes in my artery that might lead to it becoming blocked, and that, again, blockage might kill whichever tissue it's delivering to. So a heart attack means the artery that's delivering blood to my heart it got blocked or it got compromised and it couldn't get oxygen there. A stroke is the blood vessel delivering to my brain, again, was compromised, couldn't get the oxygen there. But what's led to that, but when did it start? And there on the graph, you'll see there were some changes in the artery wall in the first decade, and certainly progressive from the second and third decade. I used to find it interesting when we did health screening on people in their 40s and 50s, and we're finding arteries that are 70% blocked, but we weren't working out why that had started in their 20s more aggressively than it should have done. And the reality is, from the minute you're born, your cardiovascular system is being in some way challenged by the things that travel around in your bloodstream, by the lifestyle you lead. But medicine only gets quite interested when it's moving to the point where there's a real, significant, potentially symptomatic problem. And here's another, again, difficult thing to note. You've probably all got some degree of cardiovascular disease. You're just not at a point that it's symptomatic or compromising. And yet that's part of life, that's totally natural. But is the level you've got far ahead of where you should be? If I'm 47, it's my birthday on Monday, if I'm 47, do my arteries look like a 57-year-old's or a 37-year-old's? And that's a really relevant question to ask. So when we look at the parameters we're talking about today, this is not an old person's game. Prevention is about stopping the problem before it starts, not finding the problem before it kills you. That's diagnostics. That's a different challenge. What we're talking about today is, what are the elements that cause a lovely, squidgy, responsive, spongy artery in my youth to become narrow, stiff, and something that's more brittle and likely to challenge my ability to deliver oxygen? And that's what we're talking about with the parameters today. And that journey doesn't start in your 50s and your 60s. That journey is as relevant in your 20s as it would be in your 70s. And if I know I've got higher levels of elements that irritate and cause this challenge to my artery, then I can correct that before the problem starts, not correct it once it's already been. So let's look at those individual parameters as we go through. What's the first one? So the first parameter, blood pressure. I look at, again, modern technology, and I look at some very sexy and cool screening, and there's all sorts of new devices coming out. Again, we've got the founder of Spotify launching a new 3D scan, and it gives you this incredible image of your body, and it's all very sexy and exciting. But blood pressure is still a rock star. And if we get lost in doing complicated screening testing without remembering how important blood pressure is, then we've missed the wood for the trees. Blood pressure, what is it? Well, let's start with the basics. You have a pressurized system. So I've got one heart. I think fish have two hearts, but you can check me on that. I'm not a fish physiologist. But I've got one heart. Fundamentally, as that heart pumps, the blood is now going to get down to my toe, but it's got to get from my toe back to my heart. So I need a pressurized system that enables blood to circulate my entire body. And really, when we're looking at blood pressure, we're looking at what is the pressure that your blood exerts on the walls of the vessels that carry it. And we're interested in that because we need enough pressure to circulate blood. And that's why people with low blood pressure historically are prone to fainting. Now, fainting is such a brilliant, fascinating thing. Its technical word is syncope. But fainting is just the fact that your body didn't have enough pressure to get blood into its brain, so it makes you pass out, so you lie horizontally, so the blood just flows back into your brain again. That's why when someone faints, you don't keep them propped upright and you put their legs up. If you lift their legs up, you're literally tipping blood back into their head. So a low pressure system is more likely for things like fainting or getting dizzy because you can't get blood all the way up against gravity into that head of yours. And the brain loves blood, loves oxygen, so it's quite greedy. So low blood pressure is a problem from a circulatory perspective, but high blood pressure is a real challenge to our cardiovascular system. And when we look at high blood pressure, we're saying actually the pressure that the blood is exerting on the walls of the arteries is greater than those artery walls would like. Now, when I showed you that last picture of an artery and you saw the inside, the sort of concave wall, you might have noticed there was almost a little hexagonal pattern. And that's basically that the tiles on the inside of your arteries are amazingly intelligent, beautiful cells called endothelial cells. Why is that relevant? Well, if you have high blood pressure, you're creating much more shear stress against that wall, and that creates the opportunity for the artery to go from that squidgy, reactive, elastic form to something that's stiffer and more likely to cause you a challenge. So when pressure is high, it's a greater irritant to the wall of the blood vessel and directly causative of a multitude of problems. When blood pressure is, again, too high, the challenge we have with it is that it doesn't have any symptoms. You'll see on the screen there. It's often called the silent killer. Now, most of the things traveling in our bloodstream don't produce huge symptoms. Glucose, a little bit of an exception, we'll come to that. But blood pressure, if it's too high, is causing this regular friction against the walls of the artery. But equally, it means your heart has to work harder with every pump to circulate blood. So it's an absolute double whammy. If I've got high blood pressure, my heart has to pump against that blood pressure to get blood all the way around the body. And so we often find in people who have high blood pressure for too long, they might even have an artificially large heart, which has grown because it's constantly battering against this pressure that stands at the wall of the first artery it meets. So high blood pressure is a real challenge for the heart itself as a muscle, but it's a real challenge particularly for the blood vessels that have this scraping of blood down the wall, like a real force through the pipes that makes the other risk factors even more likely to be a problem. So blood pressure sits at the heart of all things cardiovascular. It's, again, such a silent parameter that, again, most people have forgotten about it, and that's actually sort of dropped off the radar in mass screening, yet its integrity and its importance to health is as high, if not higher, than ever before. If we go to the next slide, please. It's prevalent, so 1 in 3 has got high blood pressure. That's wild. When we look at some of the factors that cause blood pressure, that will become a bit more obvious why that is. One of the great challenges here is not necessarily what we call cardiovascular disease, well, it is, but strokes. And again, when I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, there's sort of maybe a romanticized idea on a heart attack. And again, if you've had one or you know someone who had one, there's nothing romantic about it. But a heart attack does have a sort of fairly clean, it's done, if that's my way to go, that's my way to go. Strokes are a different connotation altogether. A stroke, of course, is a stop of the blood supply to the brain, and whatever part of the brain was starved of oxygen dies. And if that part of the brain was responsible for movement or speech or other functions, that capability can often be lost forever. So when I'm thinking about the parameters today, on a more emotional basis, from my perspective, I'm on a stroke prevention rather than a heart attack prevention, because I am my brain, and the more I preserve that organ, the more important, again, or hopefully the more I can enjoy not just this current period of my life, but the years to come. From a cost point of view, if you're out there from a policy point of view, we've got a £2.1 billion cost directly associated with uncontrolled high blood pressure. Lots of people have got it. Most people don't know they've got it, doesn't produce symptoms, and it's a real catastrophe for physiology. So again, something we should be very much aware of. Next slide, please. What is the measurement? So pressure can be measured in millimeters of mercury, and effectively the most confusing part about blood pressure is why we have these two numbers. Well, if I check the pressure of my water system at home, I'll have one pressure because I've got one pump continually pumping water. But you don't have a consistent pump, you've got a heart. So the reason you've got two pressures is you have a pressure in your blood vessels when your heart contracts and blood moves faster and blood vessels constrict, and pressure is flow times resistance. So if the flow is faster and the resistance is more because the vessel is smaller, that number will be higher than when the heart is refilling, the gap between heartbeats, if you like, where that pressure will be lower. Now, both figures have a critical importance from a healthcare point of view, with potentially the top figure being more relevant for strokes and the lower figure more relevant for heart challenges, but they're both absolutely intertwined. We're interested in both, and when we normally classify someone's blood pressure, whether it's high or not, it's whether one of those meets the criteria of being elevated, not whether both do. So we've got a pressure when your heart beats. The technical word for heartbeat is called systole, which is why it's called systolic, and diastole is the refilling, the gap between heartbeats, which is why it's called diastolic. They're both relevant. You want them both within recommended range, and the numbers here get interesting. So really, doctors and most medical professionals get interested in blood pressure being below 140 on the top figure and below 90 on the diastolic, the second figure. You often hear the number 120 over 80. Now that's, again, the sort of yardstick of what is generally determined to be optimal blood pressure. Now, I always ask this question to people I'm training: is 120 over 80 better or worse than 110 over 70? I say that because 110 over 70 is probably better, because less pressure, less strain, and no likelihood of circulatory problems. So the number isn't to aim for 120 over 80, it's to be as low as possible without challenges to circulation, i.e. I'm getting dizzy, I'm fainting, etc. So having as little blood pressure as possible from a cardiovascular point of view reduces the strain on your blood vessels, reduces the strain on your heart, and again, there are a multitude of factors that influence both of these figures that we should be aware of. If we go to the next slide, I'll cover some. So again, actually on this one, who should get it tested? So everyone. It's a case of, if you're under 30, you're likely to have a stroke. No, you could. And again, we're seeing younger and younger individuals encountering blood vessel disease of the brain, and again, what we call cerebrovascular disease. But if you're over 40 and you've had that potential period of time where your arteries are not as flexible as they used to be, a less flexible artery is more likely to be stiffer, which is less likely to expand under pressure, and blood pressure will often go up. So over 40, this is something that really I would never advocate for someone going a year without testing. And if that result is not optimal, then it's potentially checking that a couple of times a year to see what the impact of your lifestyle is, or whether it's coming down or not. Clearly, from an over 140 and over 90 perspective, we want a medical professional to work out whether this should be a medicine approach or whether this could be managed through lifestyle. And lifestyle has a massive impact on blood pressure. So when we think about what drives increase in blood pressure, there are certain factors that drive that in. The first big one would be weight. If we go to the next slide, that'd be great. So when we look at blood pressure, again, there's no single cause. If you've got high blood pressure, it's not because you ate too much salt or because you're not fit enough. There's no one thing that causes this for everyone. And we often find this is something that has a strong genetic or hereditary component. But even if you've got dodgy genes, not the ones you wear, but dodgy genetic material from your parents, there's still an ability to influence blood pressure through lifestyle. The big things here that you often hear about, I mentioned, are weight. Weight is a bit like a mechanical pressure, so if I physically put 2 extra kilograms of weight on my arm, then the blood vessels get a bit more compressed, and therefore the pressure goes up. Think of squeezing a hose in your garden. As you squeeze the hose, the pressure goes up, because you've narrowed the diameter, you've increased the resistance. So when we're looking at weight management, particularly body fat, and particularly body fat sitting in the internal organs, which I'll touch on later, that has a direct impact on blood pressure. Things that will increase my blood flow will increase my blood pressure, and that's why stress plays a particular role. So when we see people with high levels of continually being switched on, ready, unable to switch off, and that would include poor quality sleep, that has an impact. The biggest nutritional piece will historically be sodium content, which is great. So sodium, again, salt in our diet, and that salt means my body retains more fluid, and that fluid stays in my blood, and I've got more blood. And that's why often people with high blood pressure are given a diuretic, which gets rid of some of that fluid. But if I've got too much salt in my diet, I retain more fluid in my bloodstream, and that increases the pressure. Our big mechanism here is, can I have less salt in my diet? Can I control my weight? And the benefit of physical activity is wild. So low intensity cardiovascular exercise, so walking at a brisk pace, light bike riding, light swimming, has historically shown to improve blood pressure significantly. And if I improve your blood pressure, on the next slide, by 10 millimeters of mercury, then you reduce your stroke risk by a fifth. And exercise alone, irrespective of diet and other bits, has been shown to do, that is 10 off both. So that might take your blood pressure from 140 to 130, from a 90 to an 80. And that change means, again, a 20% reduced risk of getting a stroke. So when I look at exercise, so rarely am I talking about how someone looks. I'm definitely interested in how they feel, but regular movement has a crucial role on decreasing the pressure in your blood vessels. That makes it easier for your heart to pump, less likely for blood vessels themselves to become aggravated. It's a massive win for you. So amongst that, again, checking it regularly, which you can do at home in between appointments. Being aware of it is critical. You need it to circulate blood. If it's too low, different challenge altogether and one to discuss with a GP. But most people too high because too much of our food has too much salt in it. We're not active enough. Our weight's not as we'd like it. So things to bear in mind there. But certainly knowing your number is a critical first piece. We next move on to maybe the most misunderstood and probably the hardest to unpick, to really, give this a fair due, but cholesterol. Cholesterol's a bit like stress. You hear the word, everyone's like, oh, it's negative, it's terrible. You are made of cholesterol. Pretty much every cell in your body is constructed using cholesterol. So we need it. But what's the problem? Why does it get such a bad press? Well, you generally hear it's a waxy fat substance that travels in your bloodstream, and it is a primary cause of when your arteries go from soft and rubbery to stiff and hard and damaged, that atherosclerotic process. Cholesterol itself is an incredibly important component to human physiology. So like I said, cells are made from it. You also make hormones from it, things like testosterone, cortisol, things that keep you propped up and alive. You also make bile acids from it, things that break your food down. So it's a rock star. And your body makes most of the cholesterol that you've got in your bloodstream rather than takes it through its diet. But we don't want too much cholesterol. So the interesting piece with cholesterol is that it's made up of these different component parts that are often called good and bad. Now, technically that's wrong because cholesterol is just cholesterol, but you've got one molecule that carries cholesterol, again, away from your liver and into your circulatory system, and one that carries it back to be processed. And our worry is if you have high cholesterol, then you have too much of the carrier called LDL, and that LDL has a predisposition, or LDL cholesterol, to enter the spongy, lovely wall of your arteries. So what actually happens, cholesterol doesn't stick to the wall of your artery. I remember an advert in the 2000s where it had a sort of cholesterol mimicked as fat that was dripping out of an artery. It was a disgusting advert. Cholesterol doesn't do that. What cholesterol does is if it's the low density lipoprotein, LDL, what's called bad cholesterol, it's carrying cholesterol through your bloodstream. And because it's tiny, it enters these little gaps in your endothelial wall, which would be triggered by the damage caused by blood pressure. So all these things work together like an orchestra. And as it goes into your artery wall, your own immune system comes in to kill it, and in doing so creates what we call an inflammatory reaction. So the less LDL cholesterol we have circulating, the less likelihood we have of that cholesterol molecule entering my artery wall and all of the things that happen afterwards. That mean the artery goes from nice and wide to suddenly it's only 50% diameter, 30%, and so forth. So we believe in knowing cholesterol because there's a direct correlation between your total cholesterol and what percentage of that is LDL. And in the Know Your Numbers, we only take a total cholesterol because the analytics required to break it down into this fractionation are not possible at what we call a point of care. So we can't give you a result there and then. But there is that strong correlation between total cholesterol, the volume of LDL, and this LDL is a number you want as low as possible. If I can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So what do? We take a finger prick, again, trying to avoid venous blood draws. Venous blood, again, is a slightly separate mechanism to take your finger prick. Finger prick often gives me the result there and then. We call that point of care, so we can discuss the result in real time, which is absolutely crucial. And again, we're looking at total cholesterol rather than how much is what's called good, incorrectly to a degree, how much is bad. So HDL, the healthy type of cholesterol, high density lipoprotein, has a different molecular structure. It's a bit bigger, denser, so it can't get into the wall of the artery. So the shape of these two molecules really defines which one's a troublemaker and which one's a friend. And HDL cholesterol, which is cardioprotective, really was trying to work out how we can boost that number up, but exercise seems to be the number one modulator of it. So all roads point back to Rome, as I'll mention several times through this. More exercise means more likelihood of more HDL cholesterol. So next slide, please. So when we're looking at the numbers for this, it's good to have numbers in mind. We want ideally cholesterol below 5 millimoles per litre. If you've ever heard a result in something called milligrams per deciliter, mg per dl, that's the European and American unit. We're quite unique in Britain that we use our own parameter to collect this. If you've got a result that's 200 and someone else got a result of 5, don't worry, you're not in significant trouble. They're just using a different conversion metric. And to take, again, a UK unit to anywhere else in the world, you times it by about 39. It's just over 39. So if I take my 5 and times it by 39, I end up with an equivalent of 200, just to frame that. So we like cholesterol below 5. Doctors, again, might want you lower still if you've got other factors that all work together. If your blood pressure is high and you're smoking and you're carrying too much weight, then we might want that cholesterol even lower. But generally, when doctors look to target this, they'll do so based on that collective risk factor and how much LDL you actually have, or non-HDL is another way of representing that. So in simple terms, again, it's a fat that you need, but if there's too much of the LDL type, that goes into the walls of arteries, over time aggravates and causes them to get inflamed. That becomes the narrowing and stiffening that people call atherosclerosis. HDL cholesterol moves the cholesterol in a different direction and almost fights with the LDL. It's quite a weird relationship, and I've never really understood why you add the good and the bad together to get one number, but that's the way it's done. And so fundamentally, we want your cholesterol certainly below 5.5 and ideally below 5. That is influenced by whether you fasted for 12 hours, so we do sometimes do a 12-hour fast or 4-hour semi-fast, because the volume of food you've eaten will also affect this. And that ties into what makes cholesterol. The reality is that is a huge debate within modern medicine. What is the key diet to target this? There's a diet approach called a portfolio diet, which says if I want as little LDL cholesterol as possible, my diet will be absolutely rich in plant proteins, so plants predominantly, be rich in fibers, be rich in monosaturated fats, and those are the fats that, again, that are generally liquid at room temperature. And it's almost a sort of a version, about adding some nuts and seeds, of the Mediterranean style of eating. What does your cholesterol not like? It doesn't like saturated fat. Not all saturated fats are equal, particularly processed foods. So processed animal meats seem to be a big trigger factor for raising cholesterol. It also doesn't like refined sugar. So if I think that 50% of the UK diet at the moment is what we call ultra-processed food or hyper-palatable food, most of that food has got a little bit too much salt because it's being preserved. The salt, again, keeps food fresh for longer. It will be processed to the point where there'll be additives and elements to the meats, which again makes it, again, processed meats. It'll be likely high in refined carbohydrate and sugars. And it's an absolute trigger for blood pressure and cholesterol. And we think back to that graph of these diseases rising. When we look at the volume of calories, so 50% at the moment of UK calories coming from food that would directly affect every result I talk about today, we have to recognise dietary change is probably our critical component. On a simple basis, rather than talking about principles, we're talking about as many plant-based foods as possible, vegetables and fruits of different colours, different types, and the fibres within those, as well as the colours, have an amazing role in cholesterol. Fibre has a multifactorial role in reducing cholesterol. We want that 30 grams of fibre a day to not just help move the cholesterol out of the bloodstream, but also activate the bacteria in your gut that further help reduce that bad type of cholesterol. The body's a genius machine, it's just not getting the instructions that it wants from the diet that doesn't have these things in it. Oily fish, so things rich in omega-3, so mackerel, sardines, salmon, these are fantastic as well for helping manage lipid profiles. And ultimately, we're looking for a diet that is rich in fibre, rich in, again, omega-3 oils, that's diverse in colour and form, predominantly plant-based, and nuts and seeds, they're all in there. So that Mediterranean style eating, reduction in processed food, will in most cases have a massive impact on cholesterol, in the exception that some people have familial hypercholesterolemia, which means you just got dodgy genes from your mum and dad and you make more cholesterol than someone else does. But in almost all cases, improving these dietary patterns will reduce the volume of LDL and the likelihood of, over time, that irritation and aggravation of the blood vessel wall. We jump on. Blood sugar. Probably, again, if I look at my echo chamber of social media, everyone's talking about blood glucose or blood sugar, and those two phrases used interchangeably. And as you sit there now, you're running on sugar. I mentioned you're running on oxygen and sugar. Those are two things that generally the body needs at a fairly constant level all the time. Our brain really only uses sugar, and it's the most hungry of all the organs in terms of how much energy it demands. So what is blood sugar? Well, sugar is a fuel for your body, and what you want in your bloodstream is enough fuel so all the key mechanisms are covered, but not so much that it damages your body. So blood glucose is a bit like Goldilocks. The porridge being too cold or too hot, we want glucose just right. We want it right in this middle range where it's not too high nor too low. And realistically, in most people, our question mark is not so much about too low. That's more of a challenge for people who have to inject a hormone called insulin and people with type 1 diabetes. But our challenge is is my blood glucose too high, too often, and that can be a real challenge to my physiology. So ultimately, blood sugar changes through the course of the day. If we go to the next slide, you'll probably be aware of lots of people wearing a piece of technology that was designed for people with a condition called diabetes to help manage their sugar appropriately. And these are these devices you see people sticking on the back of their arm, continuous glucose monitors. And we've now got the new science of people trying to optimize their glucose levels. They don't want sugar going too high or too low during the course of the day, because there's growing understanding that might interfere with performance, and that performance being how sharp I feel, but also how athletic I am, how lethargic I am, my predisposition for being hungry and making poor food choices. And it's become the new sort of metric of superhumans, these continuous glucose monitors. But let's go back one step. Humans rely on sugar, that's great. Why would my sugar go too high? Well, ultimately, if my body ingests carbohydrate-rich foods that have been refined, then the carbohydrate in those foods may enter my bloodstream quicker than I anticipated. Let me give you an example. If I had something very fibrous, like rye bread, and I compared that to, again, a piece of white bread, the white bread has been refined, and the grain within it has been chopped up, and it's almost mimicked what I would do in my mouth. It's almost pre-chewed food. So I haven't got to break it down with my molars, I haven't got to break it down in my mouth, my stomach. It's refined, so it very quickly goes from food in my hand to blood sugar. It turns into sugar very quickly. We used to call this the glycemic index, or we still do, and it was hugely popular as a diet methodology. But glycemic index is how quickly will a food turn to sugar in my bloodstream. If I eat the rye bread, it might have the same number of calories, but the fibre in it, the fact it's more chewy, I have to eat it slowly, means it gradually gets broken down by my body and enters my bloodstream more slowly. And our question mark with blood glucose is, am I eating too many refined carbohydrate foods that's causing my glucose to spike, and is that spike damaging to my health? And that's what these monitors are looking for. Ultimately, the way the body stops glucose spikes damaging us is it has a protective hormone called insulin. So glucose is really good for you until it's too high. And then what glucose does, if there's too much of it, it covers healthy cells in sugar, starves them of their ability to get nutrients, and they die. So glucose is great until there's too much, and the body knows that's really damaging, so it's got a very clever hormone called insulin that says, oh, your glucose is a bit high, I'll take that glucose and I'll store it in the cells and make sure it goes away. When we're looking at glucose control, what we're really talking about is this individual eating too many refined carbohydrates in the presence of too little physical activity. And those two things would mean they're regularly surging glucose, asking insulin to solve the problem, and over time, these monitors are suggesting that that would be detrimental to your health. When we check glucose within our parameters, we're doing a fasted glucose for a very simple basis, which is, do we feel this individual can stop sugar going too high, or are they at increased risk of developing this condition called diabetes? Diabetes in Latin literally means to pass through, and diabetes mellitus means to pass through honey. Why? Well, in the old days, the worst job was to be the sort of the health assistant to the royal family, because if they had the disease of excess, their urine turned sweet, and it was someone's job to sip their urine and work out if they'd had too many cakes and buns and they'd gained too much weight. And because there's a correlation between excessive body weight and a decreased ability to use insulin, we found, even from the early days, a correlation between lifestyle and this disease. So diabetes mellitus needs to pass through honey, because if your body can't stop sugar going too high, it starts, instead of getting rid of it in its bloodstream, it starts weeing it out, peeing it out. And that's why people develop increased thirst, to drive more urination, to get rid of that extra glucose. So that particular challenge is something that we're trying to not have someone testing your urine late down the stage, but we do a fasted glucose to say, after a period of not eating, we would expect your glucose to be below a certain level. If we go to the next slide. And if it is below that level, then we're fairly confident insulin, the hormone that stops sugar going too high, is working. And diabetes type 2 is generally where insulin stops being effective and it can't stop sugar going high. Diabetes type 1 is more of an autoimmune disorder where my body's no longer able to make insulin in most cases, and they're the people who have to inject it exogenously. So they have to add it in. So both diabetes have the same, again, conundrum, which is how do I stop my sugar levels in my blood rising too high that it damages cells? But ultimately, they have a different approach to how you get there. The parameters on the screen again are in milligrams per deciliter. If you're used to millimoles per litre, you divide this one by 19 to get some of the figures you're familiar with. There's three different parameters we're interested in. The first figure is a percentage, and that's something called HbA1c, and that's a way of looking whether you've had too much glucose in your bloodstream over the last 3 months, based on how much of your hemoglobin is covered in glucose. So that's the real diagnostic marker used by GPs to try and determine if you have developed, again, type 2 diabetes in particular, the more likely one to develop in later life. Then we've got non-fasted ranges and fasted ranges. In fact, the other way around. We've got fasted ranges and non-fasted ranges. So if you've eaten, we would expect more glucose, but we still wouldn't expect too much. And when we're doing a know your numbers, we're trying to work out, we're having had, again, 4 hours of not eating, if your glucose is above a certain number, we think you might be developing either type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. You're no longer able to keep that glucose as under control as we would like it. So that, from a management perspective, is a preemptive strike. If we catch someone at that stage, highly reversible. And in fact, when people do develop the condition type 2 diabetes, there's now growing understanding we can put that condition into remission. It used to be called reversal, but if I improve your body's ability to keep glucose stable, you effectively are someone who doesn't suffer from type 2 diabetes. So diabetes is a condition where I can't stop the glucose levels in my blood rising up too high. High glucose damages cells, and that's particularly damaging for the cardiovascular cells. So when we look at that, again, beautiful inside wall of our artery, it does not like high glucose levels. It also doesn't like high insulin levels. So if I've led a lifestyle that's contributing to my body having high glucose, high insulin, that, from a cardiovascular point of view, is not where we want to be. So corrections for that, if we go to the next slide, really, when we look at what drives, again, poor glucose levels, there isn't empirical evidence to show that having a regular spiking diet, so eating refined carbohydrate and being inactive, causes type 2 diabetes. That's really important. There's a genetic component, but the biggest known factor is carrying too much body weight and too much body fat. Hence, again, why we'll do a body fat in a minute in the same program. Body fatness, and particularly body fat, inhibits our body's ability to use insulin, and it's the major driving force of this. There's, again, warring factions in almost everything I'm talking about, and I'm trying to draw the line of happy medium. Some people would say too much glucose in your diet is the cause of all these problems. That piece of data isn't quite there yet. But too much processed food, too much body fatness, too little movement, plus whether you've got, again, good genes or bad genes, will make it more likely whether you develop this condition. If you develop type 2 diabetes, that does not mean it was the lifestyle's cause. But again, we know improving, again, the quality of fiber, the quality of protein, the pace of eating, how active you are after meals, and again, decreasing body weight and body fatness is an amazing way to turn that condition from a problem into something that doesn't bother you whatsoever. If we go to the next one. So, body mass sits at the heart of lots of this. So body fatness and body weight are two different challenges. And I use the word fatness in a medical term. We have a growing weight crisis in the UK. That's a challenge for us in the fact that, well, my TV's just gone up 13, if there's any ability. So we have, again, a growing rate of obesity. So obesity is a technical term. It's not a slang term, and it really is defined by whether the mass of your body meets a criteria to determine obesity. When we look at the statistics, we're seeing, again, a bit like cardiovascular disease, a rising tide of people who are overweight, and about half of the people overweight classify as being obese, which means they've got a body mass index of more than 30. Body mass index is the sort of global way of determining whether your weight is good or bad, and it's effectively a simple calculation, which is your height in meters. So if I'm 1 meter 85, I do 1.85 squared, and that will give me 3.6 or something. I take my weight in kilograms, 85 kilograms, and I divide it by that first number. And that will give you a number somewhere, again, between, ideally, from an ideal weight perspective, 18.5 to 25. And that's literally how many kilograms you weigh per meter squared. So it's quite a funny statistic. We use body mass index really as a population tool to try and work out if groups of people or countries or again, a particular cohort of the workforce are overweight, but it doesn't tell us about what makes up that weight. But in most cases, most people who carry too much weight are carrying too much of their weight from fat. And that's what we're worried about. Fat itself is this thing that sits underneath almost all the parameters I'm talking about today. If I carry too much weight and too much weight is fat, that will increase the likelihood of a higher blood pressure. That will make me less fit, because fitness is per kilogram, which is a really challenging number. So my fitness is worked out per kilogram. If I've got more body fatness, it creates an environment that makes it more likely for me to desensitize to insulin. If I've got more body fatness, it makes it more likely that I'll have higher levels of these lipids, the unwanted LDL cholesterol. So when we look at weight, is it a risk factor on its own, or is it the risk factor for the risk factors? And again, because the fat tissue itself is what we call inflammatory, it does have a direct role on physiology, it's tough. You know, from a cardiovascular point of view, if you're carrying excessive weight and too much of the weight is fat, it is tough. Now, we'll all know, many people who were slim, ran a marathon, got a heart attack. And we'll also know someone who smoked and was overweight who didn't. And everything when we look at cardiovascular disease is sort of statistical modelling. And that's why we like the personalised approach. But in principle, it is tough for your physiology to be well from a cardiovascular point of view and be carrying that extra weight. If we just jump to the next slide for me, that would be great. Well, so BMI, this is the figure, body mass index. I wouldn't really use it, the key groups that are neglected by BMI are, muscular adults. So there's a famous stat that the whole England rugby team that won the World Cup many moons ago, 2003, were all classified as obese, but they weren't clearly a weight problem because they had lots of muscle mass. Equally, we're finding a lot of people who've got low mass, so they're lean, but not much of their weight is made up of muscle. And it's for that reason, whenever we talk about, again, weight, we try and talk about the next figure, which is composition. I'm never that worried about what someone's weight is, but I am worried, I'm interested to explore further if their composition is the wrong balance between the different tissues that make up human physiology. If we go to the next slide, Gary. So your body composition is again, if I divided the body into two types of blood vessels, arteries and veins, then here I'm dividing you into muscle and fat. And again, there's more to us than that, but it works simply. And when we look at weight, we're not so worried about weight, we're worried about, do you have too much body adiposity, the technical word for body fat. And a good example of that is the top two pictures. These are cross-sectional MRIs of a quadricep. That if you imagine, I've chopped my leg off, again, and I'm looking at it from the top down. And what you've got is here two people of a similar weight, the top two, where the person again on the left is in the mid-40s and has got a very low body fat. Person on the right, same age, but has got a higher body fat. And that is more tissue, more fat tissue that can contribute to almost all of the risk factors I mentioned earlier. So when we do a body composition, interestingly, when we measure someone's body fat, which we normally do by sending a small electrical current through them and working out what the electricity is passing through, is it water, is it muscle, is it fat, is it bone? We're not really, in many cases, looking to see, do they have too much fat? But we're almost asking the question, do they have inadequate muscle? And a world that's sort of super labour saving, you don't have to move much today, don't have to lift much heavy today. One of the great challenges to you is this term we call sarcopenia, which is you lose 3 to 5% of your muscle mass every decade after about the age of 35 or 40. Again, that's not good news. That loss of muscle, again, directly affects most of the parameters I'm talking about, but then we often, again, substitute that muscle with fat, not directly, but over time. And so I've got more of this tricky tissue, less of this beneficial tissue. And again, that's not something I should wake up to at 55 and try and climb a mountain, rather than address that in my late 30s and climb a mountain, a sort of an anthill, good analogy, or not. Why I put the bottom graph in there is that's the body composition of someone who's in their 70s, who'd lost a lot of muscle, but actually then took up resistance training. And again, resistance training or strength training could be gym-based or other, but the body will build muscle even in its later years, 70s, 80s and 90s. And the reason I often promote resistance training is not so someone is ripped or muscly, it's so they don't allow this change of tissue from, again, really beneficial muscle tissue which stores sugar, which controls inflammation, which looks after everything from your bones to your brain, and we start to become more of our tissue being fat, which increases blood pressure, increases likelihood of insulin resistance and diabetes, increases likelihood, again, of cholesterol and other. So your composition is a critical part. It's not about how you look, it's about whether you're really giving your arteries and blood vessels the best chance to be well. If we go to the next one. We also measure hydration. It's a tough one. The hydration changes. You should be mostly water. People might say you're mostly hot air, but you're mostly water. And the reality is we want enough water because every chemical reaction of meaning takes place in the presence of water. Two ways of measuring it. When we pass an electrical current through people, we're always interested in is how much water did that pass through. So when we do a body composition, so a weight, a fat mass, muscle mass, we also get a hydration figure that looks to see if that individual has enough cellular hydration. So that's one marker. An easier one without a test is colour of your urine. there's a fairly, I think the colours on my screen might be slightly off. If your urine colour is 7 or 8, you might need to message me afterwards. Or you're taking a B vitamin, which is something that, again, lots of people take a Barocca or similar, and that flushes through, and you often get a really crazy coloured wee-wee with that one. But on that chart, you'll see I want your urine to be clear, more straw-like, and relatively frequent, and that's a good sign that you're not, again, dehydrated. So we get a bit of a sort of biological feedback 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day if we look for it in terms of have I consumed enough water. Again, we're not as worried about caffeinated drinks dehydrating as we used to be. We know coffee and tea, they contain caffeine, that's a diuretic. The real worry with those is compromising sleep, but they don't have a huge dehydrating impact, but they should certainly be considered to be used before lunchtime if we want to go into optimal sleep cycles. So again, is that 6 to 8 glasses a day? Depends if you sweat a lot, how active you are, but enough, again, fluid and hydrating fluids that turns your urine a straw in clear colour, and we would measure that when we do a body composition in what percentage of your weight, be that 50%, 55% of your body weight should be water. It sort of ends up back at the beginning. You know, I always find it interesting that if I meet someone and we used to do a questionnaire and we say, you know, do you eat a processed food diet, you're inactive, you don't sleep, you don't manage stress particularly well, then we hear all those things and then we take their bloods and we'll see there is a likelihood of a higher glucose, there is a likelihood of a higher cholesterol, there is a likelihood of a higher blood pressure, etc., etc. So often these parameters that people think are sort of medical parameters are actually a representation of the lifestyle choices we're making on average over time. And again, you might make incredible choices and still have poor results because you've got given genes that drove that. But in almost all cases, these parameters respond to the actions on the screen here. When we take measurements, we're not doing them just so we can refer you into GP surgeries and give the NHS something to deal with. It wants you, by the way, the NHS wants these before they cause a problem, because a pound saved in prevention is thousands of pounds down the line. So again, if we find these challenges early and we nip them in the bud, be that a medication or be that a lifestyle choice, that is a huge move for NHS, for society, but for you. But it does come down to the fact that we're trying to curate informed choices around these areas. Again, I've talked about smoking a little bit. Alcohol plays particularly into the blood pressure piece and again causes great challenges across all the parameters. If we improve these all by 1%, we would expect to see, in most cases, an improvement in every parameter that I've talked about today. I'm aware of time, so I want to, again, be able to get to some of your questions, if there are any, if any of you are still there. I'm going to be keen to check whether you're still clinging on for this. But the reality is, I like a number to prove that what you're talking about is relevant to me. You know, I do my numbers because I have a personalised response to how much exercise I do, a personalised response to my diet, a personalised response to sleep and stress. And when I know my numbers and I see how much they move or don't move, it sort of tells me how hard I have to work, rather than going to a government guideline and seeing generic recommendations. The benefits of these numbers is that trending ability. If I know where I am now, I can track that over time. If I'm a little up from where I should be, that's not a drama. Nothing here is a catastrophe. But knowing it and steering it over a 12-month, 24-month period is amazing. The key benefit here is this stuff isn't symptomatic. Yes, you could see if you're carrying too much weight, you probably know if too much of it's fat, but you don't know what your blood pressure is, you don't know what your cholesterol is. Late stage symptoms and signs from these things. Yep. In most cases, the first sign or symptom of cardiovascular disease is a heart attack. About 50% of the case. So when we're looking at what signs you should be waiting for that these parameters are out of kilter, the first sign might be the last one. And again, that's a heavy end to this, but that's the reality of how you work. These aren't going to tell you you've built a problem until you put them onto a spreadsheet, put the maths in, and work out how you decrease your individual risk. And that's what I'm a strong, strong believer in. And again, taking a bit more ownership and control over your health. I believe in know your numbers. Again, these are things that I don't see a downside to this. You know, there's nothing fearful here. The reality is numbers give control. This isn't you have a disease or don't have a disease. This is a mathematical piece that if you have high blood pressure, have high cholesterol, have high glucose, too much body fat, dehydrated, over time, you're mathematically more likely to cause that irritation of the artery that might block it, become a heart attack, might block, become a stroke. And why would you not want to steer that away before it's a problem, rather than wait for it to be a problem and correct it back? So I'm a strong believer in knowledge gives control. This isn't just passing your health over to the NHS and a GP. This is also about informed choices around, again, getting away from hyper-processed food, ultra-processed food, getting towards a whole food diet, rich in fibre, rich in oils, rich, again, in healthy fats, rich in plants of different colour. This is about being physically active. This is about managing stress, sleeping well. these factors move these numbers, and in most cases they move them enough that you never have to enter a doctor's door. And Q&A. That's me whistling through. I don't know how much time I have left. But if there's any questions, I'll be delighted to field them.
Right.
Are there questions? There are.
Let's get back in.
She's back. Welcome back.
Thank you. Well done, that was amazing.
Wow.
Enjoy it.
Always a joy to stare down into a lens.
I'm going to move this a little bit. Just so.
So you're in.
There we go. Right, okay, we have had questions.
Amazing.
So, first question. Are home check kits any good for monitoring regularly?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, so, the reproducibility is good. Lots of these parameters are what we call hemodynamics. They change. So if you want to check them over time, you've got to make sure you've done the fasting, you've taken them under the correct directions. But fundamentally, it's nice to have those elements controlled by a practitioner. And you also don't want to over-measure these things. Physiology is a little bit stubborn, so some people are measuring a little bit more frequently than we might suggest. So, whether that's within a 3-month period, that wouldn't necessarily be entirely logical, but certainly 3 to 6 months is a good window to retest. But bloods, they're pretty useful. Of course, the further up the chain you get, the more reproducibility you get in the results. So there's a better validity in a venous blood draw than there is to a finger prick taken at home. But these have enough validity to say, is there a problem or not, and whether I should go and pursue further guidance on that. So yeah.
Great. Is it too late to reverse any damage already done to arteries?
It's a great question. It's too late to reverse it, but it's able to stabilise it. So the great challenge is, there's that term atherosclerosis, which is literally a sort of a gruel or paste hardening my arteries. That can be stabilised. So that once that process has taken place, there's some, again, thoughts that there's some degree of reversibility, but the most important thing is stopping progression, which is where the real opportunity comes in. When we look at disease risk of smokers, for example, that of course diminishes year on year for every year you stop smoking. But ultimately creating that little bit of scarring and stabilising there is a fantastic solution, because if your arteries are working now and you keep them as they are now, then you should be absolutely clear for the long run.
When's the best time of day to check your blood pressure? Is there a good time of day?
Good question. So it changes during the day. So normally if you ever have it checked formally by a medical professional, they'll put a 24-hour cuff on you, and that will inflate 2 to 3 times an hour during the day and twice during the night. And the most important thing with blood pressure is that it dips during the night. So your blood pressure should be lower as your body enters that, again, low cellular activity stage. You've generally got your highest blood pressure in the morning when you've got this hormone cortisol at higher levels, and it should diminish throughout the course of the day. What you're really looking for is that average and the incidence of high levels. So if someone's tracking it, they would normally do 1 in the morning, 1 at lunch, 1 in the evening, and take an average of those 3. If someone's wondering whether you should go on a medication or not, they'll often give you a 24-hour cuff, and they'll take the averages across the day and the night one in particular will be a determinant of whether that should be medicated or not.
If you suffer from low blood pressure, is there anything you can do to raise it?
Yeah, get more stress in your life. Often there are, again, electrolyte solutions, particularly sodium, so making sure that your electrolytes are sodium, potassium, magnesium. These are, again, these elements that we need in our diet predominantly, but certainly in fluids, to regulate the volume of blood and plasma we keep within our blood. The big thing to be aware of there is again, things like compression socks. So again, making sure that blood isn't pooling in my legs. When you're exercising, not going from legs to arms or changing postural position too quickly. It's more of a lifestyle management piece, optimizing electrolytes, and in most cases some degree of resistance training can play a role, but it's more about mitigating the situations of being dehydrated, too hot, too static, which would trigger the likelihood of you, again, fainting or feeling dizzy in the first place.
Roxana has replied saying, have children.
Have children, brilliant. I could not agree more, Roxana. Yes, they will guarantee a significant elevation of blood pressure. No one's done that study, so we'll have a look at that one.
If there are employers that are watching, or employees that are watching, where's the best place for an employee to go if they want to get this check done?
Loaded gun. We do this. I suppose these tests are becoming more democratized. What at Latus we tried to do was fuse the capture of the measurement with the lifestyle choices. I again, as a physiologist, specialise in how our lifestyle influences these parameters. If we're just measuring them and going, oh, it's a problem or not a problem, I worry about that. Because ultimately these results, a bit like physiology, are linear. Better is better. So again, Latus, we do that. You can build the component parts, you can get a body composition monitor at home. Again, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for that, but you can do. You can do finger pricks and blood testing digitally. You can buy a home monitor. So you can aggregate the sources relatively easily, but to fuse it with a lifestyle professional who can give the extra bit of guidance how to change it, I would recommend us, but I would always say that.
What is a common type of resistance training?
Ooh, good question. So two real types. There's what used to be called calisthenics in the 80s, so use of my body weight to load up my muscles, or there's traditional gym-based activities where I've got the opportunity to use weights that are lighter and heavier than my body weight. So lots of people think of the gym as a place where you'd go and lift the heavy weights, but if I start with something like a push-up, that might be a barrier to some people, even doing it on their knees. So if I go to the gym, I might be able to push away 1 kilogram. Whereas if I'm doing that at home, my starting weight might be my chest, which is 15 kilograms. So, I'm a huge advocate for natural movement patterns, so pushing, pulling, all the things that you do in the real world, and that being body weight driven. But we may find a gym gives us the opportunity to start lower and end higher. And really for human physiology to remain, it needs a load into our musculoskeletal system once per week as a minimum, ideally twice. And again, the government guidelines a few years ago changed to saying you should have 2 strength-based sessions per week. They sort of snuck that in and most people missed it. But we've got 150 minutes of moderate intensity cardiovascular exercise, so cycling, swimming, running, and 2 strength sessions, and 2 balance sessions. Again, that might warrant a whole separate conversation, but the reality is anything you do that creates a load into your muscles is a benefit, but I would look at a gym membership as something that's a really good way to start that. And we're finding gyms softening to people who historically haven't been in gyms before and creating new protocols to support them.
Another question about blood pressure. Is pre-hypertension blood pressure a major concern, and what is the best measure to bring the level down?
Yeah, so hypertension is the technical word for when your blood pressure reaches that 140 or 90. So pre-hypertension is generally that range just below that. So again, 130 over 85, you're starting to get to the point where people are interested. The challenge is whether that's being caused by lifestyle or not, but the lifestyle behaviours there will be fairly consistent. Low intensity cardiovascular exercise, cycling, swimming, running, not high blast stuff, low intensity, 2 to 3 times a week. Reducing salt intake, trying to get less certainly than 2 grams of salt per day, but reducing that significantly. There's a diet called the DASH diet, which is a style of eating. Again, it's mostly vegetables, low sodium foods, high fibers, different colors, that significantly impacts blood pressure. And then things that decrease physiological stress. And you'll see, again, that's everything from breath work to the introduction of cold. That's got a really interesting connotation that's building. But importantly also sleep quality. So things that get you to sleep quicker, let you sleep deeper, will play a huge role, because again, blood pressure should dip during those sleeping hours. So it's a bit of everything. Your job would be to say, which of those are you doing worst on? So I'm good on exercise, bad on salt, do salt. Or I'm good on salt, not so good on exercise, do the exercise. There's no one thing that changes everything. It's finding the area you're naturally least predisposed to doing, and then trying to focus on that one.
And we'll just have one last question from Johnny saying, when does staying healthy become unhealthy? How balanced should we keep our perspective?
Yeah, good question. Is the tipping point. When you're leading your life for well-being, I think that's the wrong way to go. I don't lead my life for well-being. I allow well-being to ensure I can enjoy my life. We generally, that 80-20 principle is not far off. I've got to make 80% of the things or decisions that support my physiology, which means I can have 20% that don't. If you're demonizing any food, or you're punishing yourself when you don't train, or you're suffering, cursing yourself after one night's poor sleep, then that balance is tipped, that you're beholden to those behaviors. I think we have to find that balance which is individualized, that says, I need the light and dark. I need to let go that every behavior must be positive, but I must make more positive behaviors than negative. And again, that normally needs a little bit of personalization rather than me blasting that through a webinar. But I think the key principle is, if you stop being kind to yourself, then this is tipped too far. And that's a really important phrase to bear in mind.
Lovely. Thank you, Oli.
Pleasure. Great stuff. Thank you for staying or joining.
Yeah.
Hope something useful. And again,
we've been on for an hour and a quarter.
Dear Lord.
Thank you, everyone.
If you're still there, chef's kiss.
We will let everyone get back to work now. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. You will be getting an email probably next week about our next webinar in October, so look out for that. And we hope to see you there. But thank you, everyone.
Bye.